Alrighty, so as I say, there are people who want to control you. They want to control your right to see information. They would also love to control how you raise your kids. There's a piece in the Washington Post. It was retweeted by the American Federation of Teachers head Randy Weingarten, who's one of the worst people in America. I mean, her absolute scorn for the parents of America is truly astonishing. Okay, she retweeted this piece. The piece is titled, quote, "Parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' school curriculum. They don't." Yeah, we do, actually. It's written by Jack Schneider, an assistant professor of education at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Jennifer Berkshire, a freelance journalist and co-author of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School. And the idea is that only school boards, only government actors, only the wise will determine how your children are to be educated. Now, what's kind of amazing about this is that the rise of the public education system in America, if you actually look back historically, was not particularly a bad thing, but it also was kind of an anti-Catholic thing. If you look at how public schools were supposed to operate, they were almost designed to operate as anti-Catholic indoctrination centers. And people talked pretty openly about this at the time. So from the very beginning, there's been open debate about how kids are to be taught in schools and whether schools are simply supposed to convey reading, writing, and arithmetic, or whether they're supposed to impose values. But parents have always had the ability to take their kids out of school, to homeschool their kids. But the left would like this not to be the case. I recently did a discussion/debate with Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks, and she openly said that she would love the Finnish model in which there are no private schools and homeschooling is verboten, in which basically you must send your kid to a government indoctrination center. Well, that's the underlying case here in the Washington Post. Quote, "In their search for issues that will deliver Congress in 2022, conservatives have begun to circle around the cause of quote-unquote parents' rights. In Indiana, Republican Attorney General Todd Rokita recently introduced a Parents' Bill of Rights, which asserts that education policy and curriculum should accurately reflect the values of Indiana families. In Florida, the legislature passed an even more comprehensive bill assuring that the state and its public schools cannot infringe on the fundamental rights of parents. Given this frenzy, one might reasonably conclude that radicals are out to curtail the established rights that Americans have over the educational sphere. Yet what's actually radical here is the assertion of parental powers that have never previously existed. This is not to say that parents should have no influence over how their children are taught, but common law and case law in the United States have long supported the idea that education should prepare young people to think for themselves, even if that runs counter to the wishes of parents. In the words of legal scholar Jeff Schulman, this effort may well divide child from parent, not because socialist educators want to indoctrinate children, but because learning to think for oneself is what children do. Except that's not what you're talking about. It's not about children learning to think for themselves. It's about parents wanting their kids to have their values and to pass their values on to their kids. It's literally my number one priority in life. And about educators who have a different set of values. This is not a value-neutral proposition, okay, which is the reason why I pick where my kids go to school. And I specifically ask the principals where my kids go to school if my kids are being taught values that I agree with. And I will not send my kids to a school where the values that I agree with are not taught. When do the interests of parents and children diverge, according to these columnists? Generally, it occurs when a parent's desire to inculcate a particular worldview denies the child exposure to other ideas and values that an independent young person might wish to embrace or at least entertain. To turn over all decisions to parents, then, would risk inhibiting the ability of young people to think independently. As the political scientist Rob Reich has argued, quote, "Minimal autonomy requires, especially for its civic importance, that a child be able to examine his or her own political values and beliefs, and those of others, with a critical eye. If we value that end, the structure of schooling cannot simply replicate in every particularity the values and beliefs of a child's home. The law has long reflected this. Consider homeschooling. Although it is legal across the country, states still regulate its practice. Such regulations aren't often enforced, but they are certainly on the books. Homeschooling parents can be required to establish minimal academic qualifications, to submit examples of student work to school district administrators, or even to adopt a state-approved curriculum. The sudden push for parental rights, then, isn't a response to substantive changes in education or the law. It's a political tactic. And then they say that it's a paranoid style of politics, quoting Richard Hofstadter, one of the most overrated historians of the 20th century, talking about how it's just paranoid to think that these people want to indoctrinate your kids. They have no political values. They just want you to have kids who challenge everything that you believe. In framing our public schools as extremist organizations that undermine the prerogatives of families, conservatives are bringing napalm to the fight. That may rally the base and tilt a few elections in their favor. But as with any scorched earth campaign, the cost of this conflict will be borne long after the fighting stops. Parents may end up with a new set of rights, only to discover they have lost something even more fundamental in the process. turned against their schools and their democracy, they may wake up from their conspiratorial fantasies to find a pile of rubble and a heap of ashes. This was retweeted again by the American Federation of Teachers head. That you shouldn't worry about the fact that they are teaching your kid radical crap in school, and the school library is filled with pornography, which is actually the case in Loudoun County, for example. No, what you should actually worry about is your own authoritarian fascism in wanting your kids to be inculcated with your values. Okay, so the plan is to hijack your kids. I mean, they're openly saying that the plan is to hijack your kids and that you really should have no say in the matter. I mean, it makes sense on a sort of demographic level, right? There's one group in the United States that is having lots of kids, namely religious parents. There's another group that is having almost no kids, namely highly secularized parents. And highly secular people in the United States are having very, very few children at this point, and people who are religious are having lots of kids, which means that down the line, if parents actually teach their kids their values and those kids live with those values, you're going to get a more right-wing, more religious country. Left doesn't like that very much. So one of those solutions is take those kids and indoctrinate them in your ideas. Put them in government indoctrination factories and churn out good little liberals. And then tell parents they have no rights. Because after all, you're just teaching them how to think. You're just teaching them to be broad-minded and open-minded and to challenge parental authority. But if your authority is challenged in any way, then it's really bad. And by the way, we know this is the case whether it comes from parents or whether it comes from students. You know how many letters I receive from public school students who say, I'm afraid to speak up in class because my teacher is going to punish me if I disagree with the teacher? Don't give me that high school teachers are teaching children how to think in the main. They're teaching their own opinions very often. And where you send your kid is going to determine what opinions are taught. It is that simple. But again, the idea here is the institutions must be upheld. And if that means curbing First Amendment rights, fine. If it means curbing parental rights, absolutely. The left is simply willing to do this. And standing up is key at this point. They also, of course, would like to curtail economic rights as well, which is why they are now pushing an unconstitutional wealth tax. By the way, it is unconstitutional. When you hear the Democrats are trying to tax unrealized gains at the federal level, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for this. Right? The Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution of the United States does not allow for this sort of taxation, which is why you had to have a constitutional amendment. That constitutional amendment to allow the income tax only allows the income tax. It does not allow direct taxation of unrealized gains. But Democrats are pushing this because, again, economic control, ideological control over your kids' education. Did it ever occur to these people that maybe we don't want to be controlled? Maybe the entire premise of American liberty is that we are not controlled and we get to make our own decisions. And then when you maximize the control of morons over every aspect of your life gets materially worse. I've been talking a lot in recent days about risk and risk allocation, about the fact that human beings tend to want to minimize risk. We don't like risk. At the very least, we don't like loss, right? And so what we are prone to is handing over authority to people who pledge that they are going to minimize our risk. But here's the thing. This is what the institutions are learning. And we learn it anew every time there's a major unexpected recession, for example. You can push off risk. You can pretend that reality entails no risk. You can empower experts to minimize risk, but all they can do is build dams against risk. The waters of risk do not go away. The best way to deal with the endemic risk in life is to incentivize people to make good individual decisions in terms of how to mitigate risk, and maybe local level decisions on how to deal with risks if they materialize. But when you pledge that you can stop all risk from happening, when you pledge that if you give somebody complete informational control, they will make your life better, or you give people complete control over your kids, they will make your life better and your kids' life better. All you're doing is building a dam that holds back the waters of risk. And when that dam collapses, there is a tsunami. Not a trickle of risk that is handleable, not a stream of risk that you can tranche off or that you can redirect or that you can use to power your economy. Instead, you create a dammed up flood of risk. And when that dam bursts, the risk overwhelms the entire civilization. And that is what is happening right now. And the institutions are cracking. Those institutions were a dam meant to prevent you from exercising your freedom to assess risk. And now, as that dam bursts, they're desperately trying to shore it up by more control. It's not going to work. They'd be better off lessening the power of the water behind the dam by allowing us to actually make individual assessments about things that matter to us, by allowing us to speak freely and access information freely, by allowing us to educate our kids as we see fit. But they're not going to do that, because to do that would, in fact, undermine their entire project, which is the control. Whether they believe it or not, whether they believe that they are making your life better if you give them more control, or whether they just want the power is irrelevant. The effect is that they are going to control every aspect of your life from soup to nuts if they have the chance. And they're openly bragging about it. I mean, the New York Times is talking about Joe Biden creating cradle-to-grave welfare programs. The phrase cradle-to-grave used to be a pejorative in American politics. It was something the Republicans said about Democrats, that they wanted cradle-to-grave care, demonstrating that they were enervating the American public. Now it's used as a piece of braggadocio by the left. The agenda is pretty much out there in the open, which means that we have the obligation to fight that agenda. It's the reason why it is so necessary to look at what big cities like Chicago are doing right now in implementing universal basic income and say to yourself, what is this designed to do except to make people more dependent on government, except to continue to foster the lie that the more control you give these people, the safer they will keep you. They're not going to keep you safe at all, because eventually reality always intervenes. And when it does, it gets really, really ugly. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.